Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of researches, articles, insights, observations, and really try to pull out the absolute core ideas.
Yeah, the nuggets you really need to know.
Exactly. It's kind of our shortcut together to being genuinely well-informed, trying to cut through all the noise and get straight to what matters.
And our mission today, well, it centers on something pretty universal, something we all navigate, sometimes, let's be honest, pretty awkwardly: arguments and conflict.
Right.
We've spent time digging into some truly fascinating researches, including some great insights shared by a Harvard negotiator. We were specifically looking for practical, actionable ways to handle those tough conversations.
The ones that make your stomach clench a bit?
Those are the ones. Ways to handle them more effectively.
Absolutely. And the mission for you, listening right now, is to hopefully walk away from this deep dive with some new ways to look at those potentially frustrating encounters.
Whether it's politics or work.
Or even just deciding what movie to watch.
Right.
And see how maybe they can be transformed into something, well, constructive. Maybe even opportunities for, like, deeper understanding.
That's exactly the kind of shift these researchers point towards.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting, kind of right from the start.
Okay.
The surprising core idea, it seems, isn't really about what we're arguing about.
You mean the topic itself, the subject matter?
Exactly that. According to these materials, the real friction, the place where things tend to go off the rails, it isn't typically the content of the disagreement.
Huh.
The problem seems to lie much more in how we approach the argument itself, the process of the interaction.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit, because I think for most people, myself included sometimes, what feels like the entire problem. Like, if they would just agree with me on X, Y, or Z, there wouldn't be a problem.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely feels that way. And these researchers, they acknowledge that right up front. They start by kind of validating that common experience. Conflict is often uncomfortable. Yeah. That feeling you mentioned, the knot in the stomach, maybe tension in the shoulders, that's a deeply human and often, unpleasant reaction.
It's not something most of us instinctively lean into.
Right. But then immediately after acknowledging that discomfort, these researchers make this crucial pivot. They argue that conflict itself isn't inherently bad.
Okay.
In fact, they suggest it's necessary. It's actually useful.
Useful. I mean, that still feels a bit counterintuitive when I think about some, well, pretty negative arguments I've been in.
I hear that. It really does require a bit of reframing. If you think about it, conflict is often the point where different needs or different values, different perspectives, where they meet.
Where they clash.
Exactly. And navigating that intersection effectively is, well, it's essential for any kind of progress, really.
Right.
Whether that's personal growth or societal change, innovation at work, or simply resolving something at home. If we avoid conflict entirely, we often just stagnate or maybe build resentment silently. So the critical question, according to these researchers, becomes how? How do we engage with it effectively, productively even?
So the challenge isn't making conflict disappear, because maybe it can't or shouldn't, but changing our relationship with it.
That's a great way to put it.
And as you said, the researchers really highlight that the main barrier isn't, say, the immigration debate or the healthcare policy itself.
Or who left the socks on the floor, or, how the dishwasher should really be loaded.
Ah, yes, those classic ones. It's about the process, the way we engage when those disagreements pop up.
Precisely. And the researchers we explored, they pinpoint 3 pretty significant common barriers that repeatedly seem to trip us up. They prevent constructive conversation.
Okay.
But the powerful part is they also show us that we can learn to navigate these. We can overcome them.
Right. So the 3 big ones. The things we need to understand to change the how, what are they?
Okay, so based on this body of work, they are identity, appreciation, and affiliation.
Identity, appreciation, affiliation. Got it.
And the idea is if we can become more mindful, more skilled in these 3 areas, the entire landscape of our conflicts could potentially change.
All right, let's deep dive into each one then. Barrier number 1, identity. Why do arguments so often escalate and get so emotional so fast?
Yeah, this is a really deep insight from the researchers, I think. They argue that conflicts become highly emotional because they tap into something, well, much deeper than just the surface issue. They tap into our identity.
Our sense of self.
Exactly. When we're in a disagreement, especially one that feels important, it often feels like a challenge to our core values, our core beliefs.
Yeah.
Our fundamental sense of who we are.
So it stops being just about being right on the issue And it becomes about defending my sense of self, my integrity, maybe my intelligence, my basic goodness.
That's it, precisely. The researchers describe it really vividly. They call it our identity getting hooked.
Hooked, like a fish on a line.
Exactly like that. Suddenly, you're not just discussing, I don't know, the temperature of the room. You feel like you're fighting for your very being.
Wow.
And when that happens, the rational part of our brain can kind of get hijacked. Emotions flood and pay. You feel defensive, maybe angry, afraid, this sense of righteous indignation.
Yeah, I recognize that feeling.
And the conversation just stops being about solving a problem or understanding a viewpoint. It becomes about protecting pride, standing your ground, preserving your sense of self, basically.
That makes so much sense. So the argument about the socks on the floor, it isn't just about messiness.
Probably not, deep down.
It might be about whether I'm seen as lazy or if my space is respected or if my needs even matter. Things that tie right into my identity as, say, a responsible person or someone who needs their home to be a sanctuary.
Precisely. The stakes suddenly feel almost existential, even in what seem like minor conflicts. And the key insight from these researchers for navigating this, it's profound, but actually quite simple. To stay balanced, to remain purposeful and effective, especially when your core values feel challenged, you need a really strong understanding of your own identity.
And my own identity.
Yes. What are the deepest values and beliefs that truly drive you? What are you genuinely standing for in this situation, beyond just, winning the point?
So it's like before or even during a conflict, taking a beat to understand why this particular issue or this interaction is triggering me on that deeper level.
Exactly. The researchers suggest cultivating self-awareness around your core identity, the values you hold dear, the stories you tell yourself about who you are. The more grounded you are in that self-understanding, the less easily your identity gets hooked by whatever someone else says or does. Or at least you can recognize it happening.
And choose a different response.
And choose a different response. It shifts your focus from just reacting defensively to understanding what's truly important to you. It allows you to engage from a place of principle, maybe, rather than just raw emotion.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. It turns that internal pressure outward into a more conscious choice. Okay, barrier number 2, appreciation. This one sounds maybe a bit softer.
It does sound softer, doesn't it? But it's incredibly powerful, and it reveals this really fascinating paradox, according to these researchers.
Okay, a paradox. Tell me more.
Think about being in a conflict. What do both sides almost universally really want?
To win, to be right.
Maybe partly, but deeper than that. They desperately want to feel appreciated. They want their perspective to be heard, validated, understood as legitimate, at least from their point of view.
Right, okay. I want you to see why I think what I think, why it makes sense to me.
Exactly. You want your logic acknowledged, maybe your feelings seen as valid. And yet, when we're in the heat of conflict, what's often the very last thing we're willing to offer the other side,
Appreciation,
we withhold it.
Because offering appreciation might feel like you're conceding. Or weakening your own position. Or maybe even rewarding them for being wrong.
That is precisely the trap we fall into again and again. We withhold the very thing the other person is craving, and often the very thing that could actually de-escalate the whole situation. But the researchers offer a really practical, almost radically counterintuitive strategy here.
Okay, I'm ready.
When you find yourself in a conflict, especially early on, make a conscious choice. For a set period, just don't talk.
Just listen. For how long are we talking?
Well, the researchers suggest setting an intention. Maybe for the first 10 minutes of a difficult conversation. Or maybe even just for the next few minutes if 10 feels too long. Your only job in that time is to understand.
10 minutes of just listening when you're feeling really fired up. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is challenging, no doubt about it. It goes completely against our impulse to defend, to counterattack, to correct them. But the researchers emphasize what you should be listening for during this time. You're not just passively hearing sounds or impatiently waiting for your turn to jump back in.
Right.
You are actively listening for the value, the logic, the rationale behind their perspective. Why do they hold this view on immigration? What principle or past experience is driving their stance on healthcare? What is genuinely important to them about loading the dishwasher that specific way?
So you're trying to understand the underlying structure of their thinking and feeling, not just debate their conclusion. You're listening for the why behind their what.
That's it, perfectly. You are trying to see the world and this specific issue through their eyes, understanding the validity it holds within their framework.
Okay, I see.
And then once you genuinely understand, or at least understand well enough that you could probably articulate their perspective back to them accurately,
Then what?
that's when you use your immense power to offer appreciation. The research suggests simple but really powerful phrases. Things like, okay, I think I hear where you're coming from, and I can understand why that makes sense to you.
Oh,
Or maybe from your perspective, given, and you mentioned something specific you heard, I can see how you would arrive at that conclusion.
okay. The distinction there is crucial, isn't it? You're not saying, you are right and I agree with you.
Not at all.
You're saying, I understand why you think that way from your point of view, and I acknowledge the validity of that perspective for you.
Exactly. You are appreciating their perspective and their right to hold it based on what drives them, without necessarily agreeing with the perspective itself.
Okay.
And the researchers are incredibly clear on this point. There's almost nothing people desire more in a conflict than to feel heard, seen, and understood, to feel appreciated. Recognizing that you have the power to offer that, even right in the middle of deep disagreement, is such a powerful tool. It can diffuse tension, build a little trust, create space for a different kind of conversation. It can fundamentally change the other person's posture towards you.
That really does shift the dynamic, doesn't it? It moves it away from just a contest of who's right towards something like an act of mutual understanding.
Well said.
Okay, third barrier, affiliation. What's the typical problem here, according to the researchers, and how do we overcome it?
Right, affiliation. The typical deeply ingrained and often, frankly, ineffective approach we fall into, according to these researchers, is viewing conflict through this lens of opposition. It's always me versus you.
Right. My opinion against yours.
My needs conflicting with yours, my political party against yours, my way of doing things against yours. You frame the other person as the obstacle.
They are the problem standing in the way of my preferred outcome.
That's how it feels, right? And the researchers use this really memorable analogy for the result of this me versus you approach. It leaves you acting like rams butting heads.
Oh, I can picture that.
Yeah, you apply a lot of force, you create impact and noise, maybe some sparks fly, but you don't actually move forward together. You just stay locked in opposition, completely exhausting yourselves.
We've all felt like those rams at some point, stuck, frustrated, just colliding.
Yeah.
So if the default is seeing the other person as the opponent, how do you break out of that headbutting cycle?
Okay, so the strategy presented in these researches is about actively shifting the emotional connection, changing the fundamental dynamic of the interaction itself.
Oh.
The goal is to turn that other person from an adversary, someone you're fighting against, into a partner.
Okay, from me versus you to what?
To the two of us facing the same shared problem. It's a radical reframing of the conflict itself. The issue isn't you being the problem to me or me being the problem to you. The issue is this challenge, this question, this situation that we both need to work on together.
So you shift the focus away from blaming each other and towards looking outward together at the problem you're mutually facing.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds like a huge mental and emotional leap to make, especially in the middle of a heated moment. How do you actually do that? How do you facilitate that shift? Is there a specific way to invite that partnership?
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the most practical takeaways from the researchers, I think. They offer a specific suggested question designed precisely to initiate this reframing.
Specific question. Okay,
Yeah.
What is it?
So instead of just stating your position again or arguing why they're wrong, you turn to them, maybe lean in slightly, and ask something like, look, I really want to find a way forward here. What's your advice on how we can get as many of our interests met at the same time?
Say that again. What's your advice?
On how we can get as many of our interests met at the same time.
What's your advice on how we can get as many of our interests met at the same time? Wow, that feels completely different.
It is. Think about what that question actually does.
Yeah.
It immediately shifts the focus from my way versus your way to how can we, working together, find a solution that considers both our needs. You are literally inviting them to switch roles.
From opponent.
From being an opponent whose ideas you feel you have to defeat to being a collaborator whose input you genuinely seek on a problem that affects both of you.
And you're asking for their advice.
Right. You're asking for their wisdom, appealing to their capacity for problem solving, but on behalf of the shared situation.
And I guess by asking for their advice, you're also subtly conferring respect and acknowledging their intelligence, which probably ties right back to the appreciation piece we just talked about.
Absolutely. You see how they interconnect. When you ask for someone's advice on a shared problem, you are inherently showing them appreciation for their perspective and their capabilities.
Makes sense.
And by using we and our interests, you're actively constructing that sense of affiliation, that partnership. It fundamentally changes the nature of the conversation. It moves it from a debate or a battle to a joint problem-solving session. Now, it doesn't guarantee they'll suddenly agree with everything you want, of course not, but it dramatically increases the chance of finding creative solutions, maybe ones that work better for both sides than either person could have found alone while they were just butting heads.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's try and bring these three powerful ideas from the researches together. We have understanding how our own identity can get hooked and learning to manage that reaction, proactively practicing appreciation for the other side's perspective, even when we really disagree with it.
Yeah, especially then.
And shifting the dynamic through affiliation, reframing the conflict as a shared problem you tackle together. What's the potential impact if people actually put these into practice?
Well, the researchers are actually really optimistic here. They state quite clearly that consciously working on these three areas, identity, appreciation, and affiliation, has the genuine power to transform your relationships.
Transform them.
Yeah. Think about your closest relationships, your colleagues at work, even those difficult interactions you might have with strangers sometimes. Applying these principles can change the quality of the interaction, make it less stressful, more productive, and ultimately maybe more connecting.
And the researchers don't just stop at personal relationships, do they? I remember they sort of zoomed out to a much broader vision.
They really do. They touch upon the possibility of these principles being the foundation for a much larger societal shift. I mean, imagine if the way we navigate a conflict in politics, in our communities, between countries, imagine if it was guided by a deeper understanding of these identity drives, a genuine effort to appreciate opposing perspectives, and a real commitment to seeing global challenges as shared problems that we face together.
It sounds like a kind of positive revolution almost, built not on antagonism and opposition, but on understanding, appreciation, and collaboration.
That's exactly the ambitious but inspiring potential vision that's laid out in these researches. A revolution in how we interact when we disagree. And the powerful, maybe grounding final point they make is that this kind of transformative change, this potential for a more connected, more effective world, it doesn't start at the top, not with governments or big institutions.
Where does it start?
It starts with each individual person. It starts with you in your next difficult conversation. The possibility is there for anyone who's willing to practice.
Okay, that is definitely a lot to think about, this deep dive into these researches on conflict resolution. It gives us three really tangible areas to focus on, doesn't it? Three levers we can actually pull.
Yeah. Managing our identity reactions.
Intentionally practicing appreciation.
And building that sense of affiliation.
Right. Reframing the problem as something you both face.
It brings it all back to the how, doesn't it? That crucial shift away from getting bogged down only in the specifics of what you disagree about to gaining some real agency by focusing on how you navigate the disagreement itself.
Absolutely. And that focus on the how, it just feels like a much more empowering and productive place to stand, doesn't it?
I think so.
So as a final thought then, for you, the listener, picking up on that idea that this transformation starts small, with one person, maybe one conversation. Think about one conflict in your own life right now.
Could be big or small.
Yeah, maybe it's a recurring disagreement with a family member or a tricky situation at work, or even just a frustrating public issue you find yourself engaging with online or offline. How might applying just one of these three principles from these researches, identity awareness, appreciation, or affiliation, how might that change the dynamic just in that one specific situation?
What small step could you maybe take this week towards better understanding your own identity triggers, perhaps?
Or maybe towards offering genuine appreciation for the other side's perspective, even if it's just acknowledging it to yourself initially.
Or maybe trying to build that sense of affiliation, perhaps by asking for their input on solving the shared problem.
Yeah, something to consider maybe before that next tough conversation inevitably arises.